In the autumn of 1881, a woman named Sarah Kestrel stood at the edge of 40 acres that everyone in Miller's Crossing agreed were cursed, worthless, and not worth the paper the deed was printed on. She had $11 left to her name, 5 children under the age of 13 standing behind her in the mud, and a piece of paper in her coat pocket that said this land was now hers. Behind her she could hear the quiet snickering of the men who'd gathered to watch the sale close. She didn't turn around. She just looked at the collapsed barn, the flooded lower field, and the house with half its roof caved in, and she said out loud to no one in particular, "Well, let's get to work." This is the story of how she did it. And it's a story that, by the time you get to the end, is going to make you look at what people call worthless a whole lot differently. Let's start at the beginning, because you need to understand just how bad things were before. You can understand how remarkable what came after really was. Sarah Kestrel wasn't born to this life. She'd married a man named Thomas Kestrel back east, in Ohio, and the two of them had come out to the frontier territory with the kind of hope that gets a lot of young families killed or broken in the first few years. But they'd made it. They built a modest but decent farm about 6 miles outside the settlement that would become Miller's Crossing, and for 11 years they'd scraped together a life. 5 children came along in that time. Daniel, the oldest, at 13, then Mary at 11, then the twins, Joseph and John at 9, and finally little Ruth, who was only 6. Then, in the spring of 1881, Thomas went out to clear a stand of timber with 2 other men from the settlement, and a widowmaker branch came down wrong. That's what they called it back then, a widowmaker. And it earned its name that day. Thomas Kestrel died 3 days later from his injuries, leaving Sarah alone with 5 children, a farm that was mortgaged up to its roofline, and a grief so heavy that, as she wrote later in letters that survive to this day, she did not know how to draw the next breath, let alone plow a field. But grief doesn't pay debts, and creditors don't wait for a woman to finish mourning. Within 4 months, the bank that held the note on the Kestrel farm, the good farm, the one Thomas had spent a decade building, came calling. Sarah had no way to pay what was owed. She tried. She sold what livestock she could. She sold furniture. She sold her mother's silver that she'd carried 2,000 miles from Ohio wrapped in a quilt. It wasn't enough. By August, the bank foreclosed, and Sarah Kestrel and her 5 children were, for all practical purposes, homeless. Now, you'd think a story like this ends in tragedy. A lot of them did, back then. Widows in that position often had exactly 2 choices that society considered acceptable: remarry quickly. Sometimes to men they barely knew and certainly didn't love, or go back east to live off the charity of relatives, arriving as a burden rather than a family. Sarah was offered both of these doors. A widower named Gerald Voss, who owned a prosperous cattle operation 2 valleys over, made it known through the church that he'd be willing to take her on, children and all, if she'd have him. And her sister in Ohio wrote, saying she and the children could come stay, though the letter made it clear there wasn't really room. Not really. Not for 6 more mouths. Sarah said no to both. This is the part of the story that people in Miller's Crossing still talk about, generations later, because nobody could quite figure out why she did what she did next. She had $11 in cash, a small pouch of coins she'd hidden away that added up to maybe 20 more, and a wagon with 2 aging mules. And instead of taking either of the safe paths offered to her, she went to the county land office and asked what was available for sale at the lowest possible price. The clerk, a man named Alva Pruitt, apparently laughed when she asked. He told her there was exactly 1 property in that price range and that she wouldn't want it. It was a 40-acre parcel that had been homesteaded 15 years earlier by a man named Ezra Coombs, who had, by all accounts, been a poor farmer and a worse judge of land. Coombs had chosen a low-lying parcel near a bend in the river that flooded nearly every spring, built his house and barn in the worst possible spots, and after a decade of failed harvests and mounting debt, had simply packed up one night and left, abandoning the claim entirely. The land had sat empty for 5 years. The house had a collapsed roof. The barn had partially fallen in on itself. The fields, what had once been cleared fields, had grown up thick with brush and saplings, and the lower pasture was, depending on the season, either a swamp or a shallow lake. The asking price set by a county eager to get any income at all out of a parcel nobody wanted was $3,200. But Sarah didn't have anywhere near that much, and the truth, preserved in county records, is that she negotiated the actual sale price down to a small fraction of that, through a combination of a tiny cash payment and a repayment arrangement secured against the land itself. A kind of deal only a desperate county land office would agree to for a property it considered essentially unsellable. Even so, it took nearly every dollar she had to close it. Alva Pruitt told her again, according to the story passed down, "Mrs. Kestrel, I feel obligated to tell you, no one has been able to make that land pay in 15 years. Ezra Coombs was a fool, but he wasn't a lazy fool. He worked that ground hard for 10 years, and it beat him. I don't say this to be cruel. I say it because I don't want to see you and those children starve." Sarah reportedly answered, "Mr. Pruitt, I've buried my husband, and I've been told no by everyone whose good opinion I once thought I needed. I don't believe there is anything left in this territory that can frighten me quite the way you seem to think that Field can." She signed the papers. Word got around the settlement. Fast, the way it always does in small communities where everyone knows everyone's business. And the reaction was mostly what you'd expect. Pity, mixed with a fair amount of amusement, mixed with the kind of head-shaking condescension that a lot of people reserve for decisions they've already decided are foolish. There's a particularly telling account from a woman named Louisa Fenwick, whose family ran the general store in Miller's Crossing, who wrote in her diary that the whole town was abuzz over the widow Kestrel's foolishness, purchasing Coombs' old sinkhole of a farm. Mr. Voss remarked at the store today that she'll be begging for his hand within the year, once she and those poor children have frozen and starved through a winter in that ruin. Several of the men laughed at this. I confess I did not find it as amusing as they did, though I said nothing. That's a detail worth sitting with for a second. Even the people who found the whole thing funny, or at least some of them, had a flicker of unease about laughing at a widow with 5 children and nowhere else to go, but not enough unease to stop laughing. Not enough to offer real help, either. And that's an important thread to hold on to, because it comes back around later in ways that are honestly pretty satisfying. So let's talk about what Sarah Kestrel was actually looking at when she and her children arrived at that property in early September of 1881. The house, and I use that term generously, was a 2-room log structure that Ezra Coombs had built himself without much skill or patience. The roof had partially collapsed under snow load 2 winters back, and nobody had been there to fix it, so rain and snow had been getting into the structure for 2 full winters and a summer. The floor, such as it was, had rotted through in the corner nearest the collapsed section. There were no doors left on their hinges. Someone, likely a passing traveler or a neighbor helping themselves to free lumber, had taken the door and one window frame entirely. The barn was worse in some ways. Half of it had simply fallen over, the support beams having rotted at the base where they met the earth, because Coombs in his inexperience had set them directly into the ground without any stone footing to keep the wood dry. What remained standing looked like it might finish the job of collapsing at any strong gust of wind. The fields were perhaps the most discouraging part, if you were the sort of person prone to discouragement. 40 acres, on paper, sounds like a lot of land. And it was. But only about 18 of those acres had ever actually been cleared and farmed by Coombs, and in the 5 years of abandonment, nature had been aggressively reclaiming that space. Blackberry brambles and sumac saplings and a dense tangle of other opportunistic growth had taken over what used to be cropland. And the lower 6 or 7 acres, the parcel that ran along the river bend, flooded almost every spring when the snowmelt came down from the mountains, turning that portion of the property into an unusable marsh for weeks at a time. Sometimes longer. Anyone looking at this property with an experienced eye, and plenty of experienced eyes, had looked at it over the past 5 years, because the county had tried more than once to interest local farmers in buying it cheap, saw a money pit. A parcel of land that would swallow years of labor and never give back enough to justify the effort. That's precisely why the price was what it was, and why Sarah had been able to negotiate it down even further. Nobody wanted it. Nobody thought it could be made to work. But here's the thing that I think gets lost in a lot of these old stories, and it's worth pulling out and looking at directly. Sarah Kestrel had spent 11 years on a working frontier farm. She wasn't some greenhorn stumbling into homesteading with no idea what she was doing. She had watched her husband and worked alongside her husband. Clear land, build structures, manage livestock, rotate crops, and deal with the 1,000 daily problems that farm life throws at you. She had a 13-year-old son who'd been doing real farm labor since he was old enough to carry a bucket. She had an 11-year-old daughter who could cook, preserve food, and manage a household better than a lot of grown women. She wasn't bringing naive hope to that ruined property. She was bringing hard-won knowledge, and she was bringing it to a piece of land that, whatever its problems, had one thing going for it that she understood better than the men who'd laughed at her: proximity to water and good soil underneath all that brush. That's really the key to this whole story. And I want to slow down here because it's the part that made this such a remarkable turnaround, rather than just a sad tale of struggle. Sarah had noticed something during her single walk through the property with the land agent, something that apparently nobody else had thought worth mentioning, or maybe hadn't even noticed themselves. The reason that lower section flooded wasn't because the land itself was fundamentally unsuitable for farming. It was because Ezra Coombs had never built any kind of drainage system, and the natural creek that fed into the riverbend had, over the years, silted up and changed course slightly, spreading floodwater across a wider area than it needed to. The soil in that flooded section, when she dug down into it with her hands that first day, wasn't sour or sandy or poor. It was thick, dark, alluvial soil, the kind that river valleys build up over centuries, the kind that, if you could just manage the water properly, would be some of the richest growing ground in the entire valley. In other words, Ezra Coombs hadn't failed because the land was worthless. He'd failed because he didn't understand what he had, and he'd built his house and barn in the flood-prone areas instead of the higher ground, and he'd never invested the labor in fixing the drainage, because he was already stretched too thin just trying to survive season to season, the way a lot of undercapitalized homesteaders were in those years. Sarah saw a different property than everyone else saw. She saw a farm with a serious solvable problem being sold at a price that reflected people's assumption the problem was unsolvable. That first day, the 4th of September, 1881, according to a journal entry that survives in a local historical archive, Sarah gathered her 5 children around what remained of a stone-ringed fire pit near the ruined house, and she laid out, in what Daniel later described in his own recollections as her schoolteacher voice, exactly what needed to happen and in what order. This is worth walking through in some detail because the plan itself tells you so much about who this woman was. First priority, before anything else, shelter that wouldn't kill them once the weather turned. It was already September, and in that part of the frontier territory, hard frosts could arrive by early October and real winter weather by November. They had, generously, 6 to 8 weeks before survival itself became the primary daily concern. The house needed a roof, at minimum, and some way to keep the worst of the wind and snow out, even if it wasn't finished or comfortable. Second priority: enough food put by, either grown, foraged, or purchased with what little cash remained, to get 6 people through a winter. This was late in the season to be thinking about a harvest, so a lot of this would have to come from wild foraging, hunting, and whatever fast-growing cold-hardy crops could still be put in the ground, plus careful rationing of what supplies they'd brought. Third priority: ongoing through the winter, as time and weather allowed clearing. Enough of the overgrown fields that spring planting could actually happen on a meaningful scale, and starting repairs on the barn so that any livestock they eventually acquired would have shelter with it, and beginning to understand and address the drainage problem in the lower fields before the spring snowmelt arrived and flooded everything again. It's a lot to ask of a woman and 5 children, the oldest of whom was 13. But here's where the story gets, I think, genuinely inspiring rather than just admirable in a distant sort of way. Because the details of how they actually pulled this off are so specific and so human. Daniel, at 13, took primary responsibility for the roof repair, working alongside his mother. They didn't have money for milled lumber, so they went into the wooded portion of the property. Coombs had left a decent stand of timber untouched on the northern edge, probably because he'd never gotten around to clearing it, and they felled small straight trees themselves, using an axe that Sarah had kept from the old farm. One of the few tools she'd managed to hold on to through the foreclosure. Splitting shingles by hand from these logs was slow, exhausting work, and Sarah's hands, according to Mary's later recollections, bled through most of September from the unfamiliar labor, but she wrapped them in cloth each night and went back out the next morning. Mary at 11 took charge of what the family came to call the food problem, which was really an enormous responsibility for a child that age. But frontier life didn't leave a lot of room for extended childhoods. She and the younger children, the twins, Joseph and John, and even 6-year-old Ruth in smaller ways, spent those September weeks foraging. This was River Bend land, remember, and it turned out that the neglected, overgrown quality of the property that everyone saw as a liability was, in this one specific way, an asset. 5 years of abandonment meant 5 years of wild growth, and wild growth on rich river-bottom soil meant an abundance of foraged food that a more tame property wouldn't have offered. They found wild grapes growing along the old fence lines. They found a stand of hazelnut bushes that Coombs himself may have planted and then abandoned. They found late blackberries still coming on in the bramble thickets that had taken over the old fields. The very brambles that everyone considered a nuisance to be cleared were in that first crucial autumn feeding the family. Mary dried and preserved everything she could, using techniques she'd learned from her mother, and by the time the first real frost hit in early October, they had a meaningful store of dried fruit and nuts that would supplement whatever else they managed to gather or grow. The twins, Joseph and John, 9 years old and apparently inseparable, according to every account that mentions them, were put to work on smaller-scale clearing, pulling brush, cutting back brambles with hand tools, and, critically, beginning the process of digging out the silted creek channel that Sarah had identified as the root cause of the flooding problem. This was not glamorous work. It was cold, wet, muddy digging, moving one shovelful of silt at a time, widening and deepening a channel that had narrowed over years of neglect. But Sarah understood something important about that task, which is that it didn't require adult strength so much as it required time and persistence, and 9-year-old boys, it turns out, have both of those in abundance if you give them a clear enough goal and check in on their progress. Ruth, at 6, was too young for the heavier work, but she wasn't left idle. She was tasked with tending a small fire, boiling water, and, in one detail that shows up in multiple accounts and always struck me as particularly poignant, collecting and sorting seeds. Whatever wild or feral crop plants they found on the property, remnants of things Coombs had once planted that had gone to seed and scattered themselves over the years, Ruth gathered and saved. Squash, some corn, a few straggling rows of what turned out to be turnips, gone wild in an old garden patch near the house. It wasn't much on its own, but combined with the small amount of seed Sarah had carried with her from the old farm and a modest purchase she made in Miller's Crossing of seed potatoes and some hardy greens, it gave them a foundation for the following spring's planting that cost almost nothing. And Sarah herself, I want to be really clear about this because it would be easy to make this story sound like she simply delegated everything to her children and supervised. That's not what happened. Sarah worked harder than any of them. She was up before dawn most days and working by firelight most nights. She split shingles, she helped Daniel frame the roof repair, she took over the creek digging task on the days when the twins' small hands simply couldn't manage the frozen mud, and she made the 6-mile trip into Miller's Crossing on foot more than once that autumn to trade preserved goods and handmade items for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. That last detail is worth pausing on. Sarah didn't have money, but she had skills. And one of the quietly remarkable aspects of this story is how she used what little market access she had. She was, by all accounts, an excellent seamstress, a skill more valuable in a frontier settlement than you might think, since manufactured clothing was expensive and hard to come by, and most families needed someone who could mend, alter, and construct garments from whatever fabric was available. Sarah began taking in mending and small sewing jobs from Miller's Crossing families, working by firelight after her children were asleep, and trading this labor for things like nails, a second-hand axe head, a small quantity of flour, and, eventually, critically, for 2 piglets from a farmer named Otto Hendricks, who apparently didn't share his neighbor's amusement about the whole situation and was willing to make a fair trade with her, even if he wasn't willing to offer outright charity. This detail matters because it tells you something about how Sarah approached her circumstances. She wasn't proud in the way that refuses help or partnership. She was proud in the way that refuses pity and refuses to be treated as a problem to be solved by someone else's decision about her life. She was perfectly willing to trade, to negotiate, to work alongside anyone who'd deal with her as an equal. She just wasn't willing to remarry a man she didn't love or ship her children off to relatives who didn't really want them, simply because that was the easier path other people had already decided was the sensible one for a woman in her position. By the time the first hard snow came in early November of 1881, and it came early that year, according to Louisa Fenwick's diary, which complains about an unseasonably harsh start to winter, the Kestrel family had a house with a functioning, if rough, roof. They had 2 rooms sealed against the wind, with a combination of new shingles packed mud chinking between the logs, and in the window openings where they had no glass. Oiled paper that Sarah had made using a technique she remembered from her own mother's stories about hard times in Ohio. They had a small but real store of dried and preserved food. They had 2 piglets in a hastily repaired section of the barn, and they had, running through the center of the lower field, a rough but functional drainage channel that Joseph and John had spent 9 weeks digging, 1 shovelful at a time. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy. Louisa Fenwick's diary, in an entry from mid-November, notes with what reads like genuine surprise that the widow Kestrel and her children were seen at the Hendricks farm, trading mended shirts for a sack of flour, and Otto Hendricks' wife remarked that the children looked thin, and that the widow herself seems entirely undeterred by her circumstances, which, I confess, surprises me, given what everyone said back in September. That phrase, entirely undeterred, is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's worth noticing, because it's the first crack in the settlement's collective assumption that this whole venture was a slow-motion disaster in progress. Winter itself, when it fully arrived, was as hard as everyone had predicted, maybe harder. There are at least 2 entries in Sarah's own journal, which was preserved by her descendants and eventually donated to a regional historical society, describing nights so cold that she kept all 5 children in one room around the hearth, taking turns feeding the fire through the night so it wouldn't die down. There's an entry from late December describing a stretch of 9 days where they didn't leave the house at all because of a blizzard, living entirely off stores they'd put up in the fall, and an entry from January where she writes, with a bluntness that I think is more moving than any dramatic flourish would be, I do not know if we will see spring in comfort, but I believe we will see it alive, and that is more than I would have wagered in September. They did see spring, and that's really where this story pivots. From survival against the odds into something a lot more interesting, which is the story of an actual thriving enterprise being built deliberately and intelligently out of a piece of land everyone had written off. When the snow began melting in late March of 1882, the moment of truth arrived for the drainage work the twins had spent the autumn on. This was the test. If Sarah's read on the property was wrong, if the flooding really was just an inherent feature of that low-lying land near the river bend, the way Ezra Coombs and everyone else in the valley had assumed, then the spring snowmelt would prove it. The fields would flood exactly as they always had. And a winter's worth of back-breaking labor would have been for nothing. It didn't flood. Or, rather, it flooded, but nothing like before. The widened, deepened channel carried the meltwater through in a controlled path along the natural low point of the property and out to the river, instead of spreading and pooling across the whole lower field the way it had for the past 5 years of neglect. And probably for years before that, too, under Coombs' inadequate management. There was some standing water for about a week and a half in the lowest corner, but the majority of that 6 or 7 acre section, the section everyone in Miller's Crossing referred to, when they referred to it at all, as Coombs Swamp, drained and dried enough to be workable by the middle of April. Sarah Kestrel, in other words, had just unlocked several acres of some of the richest soil in the entire valley, soil that had been sitting unused and unusable for at least 5 years, and probably longer, and she'd done it with nothing more than hand tools two 9-year-old boys. Spring planting in 1882 was, by necessity, a mixed and somewhat improvised affair, but a thoughtful one. Sarah didn't have the resources to plant 40 acres, or even the full 18 that had once been cleared. She made a calculated decision to focus intensively on a smaller area she could properly manage and protect, rather than spreading her family's limited labor thin across more ground than they could tend. She put in corn using the wild-gone farrow seed Ruth had collected over the winter, supplemented by a small purchase of proper seed corn that she paid for with sowing work. She put in potatoes in the newly drained lower field, reasoning correctly that the rich alluvial soil there, now that it could actually be worked, would produce exceptionally well. She planted turnips and other hardy vegetables in a kitchen garden close to the house, primarily for the family's own table rather than for sale. And in a decision that a lot of the old-timers in the settlement apparently considered strange at the time, she dedicated a portion of the upper field to flax, which she intended to process and spin herself, drawing on skills from her Ohio upbringing that weren't common among the other farm wives in that particular frontier settlement. The corn and potatoes were, in a sense, the safe bets. Staple crops that any farm family in the region grew, food for the table and for the animals, with surplus sold or traded if there was any. The flax was the interesting choice, the one that showed Sarah thinking beyond simple survival and toward what her farm could actually become, long-term, as something more than just another subsistence operation, barely getting by season to season. That first full growing season, 1882, wasn't a miracle. I want to be honest about that, because the real story is more satisfying than a miracle would be. It was a hard, imperfect year. There was a dry spell in July that stunted some of the corn. The twins, still only 10 by that summer, got sick with some kind of fever in August that frightened Sarah badly enough that she wrote about lying awake convinced she'd lose one or both of them, though they recovered within about 2 weeks. The flax crop, Sarah's experiment, came in smaller than she'd hoped, because she was learning the specific quirks of that soil and that climate as she went, without anyone else in the valley to advise her, since nobody grew flax there. But the corn came in solid. The potatoes in that newly drained lower field came in extraordinary. Multiple accounts describe the yield from that section as remarkable, well beyond what anyone would have predicted from land that had been an unusable swamp the year before. And by the fall of 1882, the Kestrel farm had its first real surplus, more food than the family needed to get through the coming winter, for the first time since Sarah had bought the property. This is roughly the point in the story where the attitude of the settlement began, slowly and a little grudgingly, to shift. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody in Miller's Crossing threw Sarah Kestrel a parade or showed up en masse to apologize for laughing. Small communities don't tend to work that way, and pride is a stubborn thing. But the shift showed up in smaller signals. Otto Hendricks, the farmer who'd traded her the piglets, apparently mentioned at the general store that he'd ridden past the Kestrel place and been surprised by how much cleared, productive-looking ground there was compared to what he remembered from the spring before. Louisa Fenwick's diary, in an October 1882 entry, notes that the widow Kestrel came into the store today to sell preserved goods and a quantity of potatoes, and Mr. Costers. Pruitt himself remarked once she'd left that he had misjudged that land and misjudged her along with it, which I found a rather large admission for a man who does not often admit to being wrong about anything. Alva Pruitt, the county land clerk who'd tried to warn her off the purchase in the first place, was apparently among the first to publicly reconsider his assumptions, which is a nice detail because it suggests this wasn't just idle gossip changing direction, but something like genuine respect building among people who understood, professionally, just how hard what she done actually was. Still, I don't want to oversell how fast or how completely opinions shifted, because the honest historical record suggests it took longer than a single good harvest to fully turn around. Gerald Voss, the widower, who'd expected Sarah would come around to his proposal once she'd failed on her own, reportedly remained convinced through at least the following year that she was simply delaying an inevitable collapse, and made comments to that effect at more than one social gathering. According to Louisa Fenwick's increasingly critical diary entries about him, there's something almost comical in hindsight about a man's ego refusing to update even in the face of pretty clear contrary evidence, but I suppose that's a fairly timeless kind of stubbornness, not unique to the 1882nd frontier. The real test, though, the one that would settle the argument permanently, one way or the other, came in the winter of 1883, which older residents of that region apparently still referred to decades later as the hard winter, a season of extreme cold and heavy snow that caused serious losses across the whole valley, hitting established farms and ranches hard, not just struggling new ones. This is where the story of the Kestrel farm stops being merely inspiring and starts being genuinely, concretely instructive, because what got them through the hard winter of 1883 wasn't luck. It was the specific, deliberate choices Sarah had made in the 2 years prior, choices that had looked, at the time, like they might just be the eccentric decisions of a woman without enough experience to know better, but turned out to be exactly the kind of resilience-building decisions that mattered most when a genuine crisis hit. Consider the flax. Sarah's neighbors, for the most part, ran farms built around the standard regional staples: corn, wheat where the soil allowed it, livestock, and a kitchen garden. This made sense. It's what worked. Most years, and frontier farmers had good reason to be conservative about experimenting when a bad decision could mean genuine starvation. But it also meant that when the hard winter of 1883 damaged wheat stores across the valley through a combination of an early wet autumn that caused spoilage and poorly ventilated storage, and then a brutally cold winter that killed off livestock that families were counting on, most farms in the region were hit by the exact same problems at the exact same time, because they were all running essentially the same kind of operation. Sarah's farm was diversified in a way that almost nobody else's was. She had corn and potatoes. Yes, the same staples as everyone else, but she also had her flax, which she'd continued to develop and improve through 1883, and which she had begun, by that point, processing into linen thread and cloth during the winter months, a skill she'd brought from Ohio that was essentially unique in that settlement. She had, by 1883, expanded her small pig operation into a modest but real herd, because pigs, it turns out, do reasonably well in exactly the kind of marshy, overgrown terrain that had made the property undesirable in the first place. The very land features that had been liabilities under Coombs' ownership had become, under Sarah's more informed management, minor assets for supporting livestock that didn't need pristine pasture. She had built, over 2 years, a genuinely diversified small operation: grain crops, root vegetables, a fiber crop nobody else in the valley grew, and livestock suited specifically to her land's particular quirks, rather than livestock chosen simply because it was what everyone else raised. When the hard winter hit and grain shortages became a real problem across the settlement, Sarah's family didn't just survive, they had surplus linen, cloth, and thread, produced through the winter months when outdoor farm work wasn't possible anyway, that she was able to trade for grain and other supplies that had become scarce and expensive elsewhere in the valley. In effect, the very choices that had seemed like unnecessary complications or eccentric experiments in 1882 became the thing that let her family not just weather the hard winter of 1883, but actually improve their position relative to their neighbors during a season when most other farms in the valley were losing ground. There's a particularly telling passage in Sarah's own journal from February of 1883, during the worst of that hard winter, where she writes, "Called upon today by Mrs. Voss, who wished to purchase linen thread. Having heard I had some to spare, I confess I did not expect, 18 months ago, that I would ever again be in a position where others came to me in need, rather than the reverse. I gave her a fair price and we spoke pleasantly, though I noted she did not stay long, and I suspect it cost her some pride to come at all." That single journal entry tells you almost everything about how completely the situation had reversed. Mrs. Voss, wife of Gerald Voss, the man who'd assumed Sarah would come crawling back to accept his proposal within the year, was now making the 6-mile trip to Sarah's farm to purchase goods that Sarah's foresight and hard work had produced, while her own household went without. By the spring of 1883, once the hard winter finally broke, the transformation of the old Coombs place was, by any measure, complete and undeniable. What had been a collapsed, flooded, brush-choked ruin 18 months earlier was now a functioning, increasingly prosperous small farm, supporting 6 people comfortably, producing a genuine marketable surplus. pot. And this is really the detail that sealed the whole reversal in the settlement's collective memory, weathering a regional hardship better than most of the established farms around it. Daniel, now 15, had grown into a genuinely skilled young farmer under his mother's guidance and his own hard-won experience, handling responsibilities that would have belonged to a grown man on most frontier operations. Mary, at 13, had essentially become the operations household manager and food preservation expert, and there are accounts suggesting other families in the settlement began asking her, specifically her, for advice on preserving and storing food efficiently. A remarkable thing for a 13-year-old girl to be sought out for by grown women who'd been running households for decades. The twins, Joseph and John, now 11, had gone from digging drainage ditches with hand shovels to managing an increasingly complex system of field rotation and livestock care that showed a level of practical agricultural knowledge well beyond their years. And Ruth, now 8, had grown from the little girl sorting seeds by the fire into a genuinely capable helper across nearly every aspect of the farm's operation. This is, I think, one of the most quietly powerful threads running through this whole story. Not just that Sarah Kestrel saved her family, but that the specific way she did it, by bringing her children in as genuine partners, with real responsibilities from the very first difficult days, produced 5 children who were, by their early teenage years, more capable and more resilient than a lot of adults in the settlement. That's not an accident. That's a direct result of the choices she made about how to face an impossible situation. She could have tried to shield them from the difficulty, could have tried to carry the whole burden herself, and let them simply be children while she quietly despaired in private, and a lot of parents in her position might have made exactly that choice, out of love, out of a desire to protect. Instead, she gave them real work, real responsibility, and real trust. And the result was a family that came through catastrophe, not just intact, but fundamentally strengthened. By 1884, 3 years after that muddy September day, when Sarah Kestrel stood at the edge of 40 worthless acres and told her children to get to work, the farm was, by every account that survives, one of the more solid and reliable small operations in the entire Miller's Crossing area. The lower field, once Coombs Swamp, was consistently producing some of the best potato and vegetable yields in the valley, a direct result of that rich alluvial soil finally being properly drained and worked. The flax operation had grown into something close to a genuine specialty for the farm, with Sarah's linen thread and cloth known and sought after well beyond the immediate settlement. The pig herd had grown steadily. And, critically, the farm had weathered 2 subsequent difficult seasons, including another rough winter in 1885, without anything like the crisis that the hard winter of 1883 represented for so many of the region's other farms, because Sarah had continued the same principles that had gotten her through the first hard winter: diversify, understand your specific land rather than farming it the way everyone else farms theirs, and build in resilience before you need it, not after. And here, finally, is where we get to the detail that I think makes this story worth telling at all, beyond just being a nice tale of hard work paying off, because plenty of hard work doesn't pay off. Plenty of people work themselves half to death on frontier land and still lose everything to bad luck, bad weather, or bad decisions, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, or to suggest that grit alone is ever sufficient. What made Sarah Kestrel's story different wasn't just that she worked hard. It's that she looked at a piece of land everyone else had already decided was worthless, and she asked a different question than everyone else had asked. Everyone else looked at Coombs's failure and asked, "What does this tell us about this land?" And the answer they arrived at was, "This land is bad. This land doesn't work. This land will beat anyone who tries it, the way it beat Coombs." Sarah looked at the same failure and asked a different question. She asked, "What does this tell us about what Coombs did specifically, and whether those specific choices were the actual cause of the failure, or whether people are just assuming the land itself is to blame because that's a simpler story to tell?" And when she dug into that question, sometimes literally with her own hands, on that very first day, she found that the land wasn't the problem, the management was the problem. And a problem with the management is a solvable problem if you understand it correctly and you're willing to put in the specific, targeted work that solving it actually requires, rather than just working hard in a general sense and hoping that effort alone will overcome a fundamental flaw that may or may not actually exist. That distinction, I'd argue, is the whole story compressed into a single idea. Hard work matters enormously. Nobody could read the details of what that family did across those first 2 brutal years and conclude otherwise. But hard work aimed in the right direction, based on a clear-eyed and correct understanding of the actual problem you're facing, is worth vastly more than hard work alone. Ezra Coombs worked that land for 10 years and failed, not because he was lazy, by every account he wasn't, but because he never correctly diagnosed why his farm kept flooding, and so he kept fighting the same battle season after season without ever addressing its actual cause. Sarah Kestrel looked at the same land for one afternoon and correctly diagnosed, in broad strokes, at least, what needed to happen. And then she and her children spent 2 seasons doing the specific, unglamorous work the diagnosis called for. By the time Sarah Kestrel passed away in 1911, 30 years after that first muddy September afternoon, the farm she built on Coombs's abandoned land had been operating continuously and successfully for 3 decades, had passed increasingly into the hands of her children and eventually grandchildren, and had become, according to local county records, one of the more consistently productive small agricultural operations in that part of the territory, weathering droughts, market downturns, and hard winters that closed down plenty of other larger operations in the surrounding area over those same 30 years. Daniel Kestrel, that 13-year-old boy who'd split shingles by hand alongside his mother in the fall of 1881, went on to expand the family holding significantly in his own adult years, eventually purchasing adjoining parcels and building what became a genuinely substantial operation by the standards of the region. Mary became known throughout the wider area for her skill in food preservation, and according to at least one surviving local newspaper clipping from around 1905, taught preservation and household management techniques to other women in the growing town that Miller's Crossing eventually became. Techniques she'd first developed as an 11-year-old girl trying to keep her family fed through a desperate first winter. The twins, Joseph and John, both went on to run their own successful farms nearby, drawing on the practical understanding of land and water management they'd first learned digging that drainage channel with hand shovels as 9-year-old boys. And Ruth, the little girl who'd once sorted seeds by the fire, eventually became something of a local expert on flax cultivation and linen production, a niche her mother had first carved out almost by instinct back in 1882, and which became, over the following decades, a genuine and respected specialty craft in that part of the territory. It's worth returning, one last time, to Louise of Fenwick's diary, because she kept writing entries about the Kestrel family for years afterward, and there's one from 1890, nearly a decade after that first sale, that I think captures the full arc of this story better than any summary I could offer. She writes, "Attended a gathering at the Kestrel farm today, along with a good number of the town's families, to celebrate the marriage of Daniel Kestrel. It struck me, looking around at the barn, rebuilt now twice over since old Coombs' day, and grander than most in the valley, and at the fields, which run neat and productive right down to the river bend that once flooded every spring without fail, that I could remember quite clearly. Standing in this same general store 9 years ago, and hearing Gerald Voss laugh about a widow's foolishness, Mr. Kea. Voss was at the gathering today as well and ate quite a lot of the widow Kestrel's cooking, and said nothing at all about foolishness, and I confess I found a certain quiet satisfaction in that, though I said nothing about it either, out of what I hope was Christian charity rather than merely good manners. I love that entry, honestly, because it doesn't gloat. It doesn't need to. It just quietly notes the distance between where everyone expected Sarah Kestrel to end up and where she actually ended up, and lets that distance speak for itself. So what do you actually take from a story like this? Sitting here more than a century later, I think it's tempting to reduce it to something simple, like hard work conquers all, or never give up. And those things aren't wrong exactly, but I think they miss what's most useful about what Sarah Kestrel actually did. The real lesson, I'd argue, is about the difference between inherited assumptions and direct observation. Every single person in that settlement who looked at Ezra Coombs' abandoned farm saw the same thing, a failure. Proof that the land itself was the problem, a story already concluded that didn't need re-examining. Sarah Kestrel was the only one who walked onto that property and looked at it fresh, who dug her hands into the actual soil instead of trusting the settlement's collective verdict about what that soil was worth, and who was willing to ask whether the story everyone had already agreed on was actually true, or whether it was just the easiest explanation for a more complicated situation that nobody had bothered to investigate properly. That willingness to look past what everyone assumes and check for yourself whether it's actually correct cost her nothing except 2 seasons of extraordinarily hard labor. Labor she was willing to do because she didn't have a softer alternative she was willing to accept. And it turned $3,200 worth of land that nobody wanted purchased for a fraction of that price, precisely because nobody wanted it, into a legacy that outlasted her, supported 4 generations of her family, and quietly, without any dramatic confrontation or comeuppance, proved every single person who laughed at her in September of 1881 completely and permanently wrong. She never asked for an apology as far as the record shows. She never seemed to need one. She just kept working, kept teaching her children, kept solving the next problem in front of her, one shovelful of silt and one split shingle at a time, until the results made the argument for her so thoroughly that nobody in Miller's Crossing needed to say another word about it. And the only thing left for the people who'd laughed to do was to quietly start asking her how she'd done it. And if there's one image from this whole story that I think deserves to stick with you, it's not the laughing neighbors, and it's not even the successful harvest that finally proved them wrong. It's that first afternoon in the mud, in front of a collapsed house and a fallen barn and a flooded field that 15 years of a previous owner's honest effort hadn't been able to fix. When a woman with $11 to her name and 5 children depending on her looked at the very worst that the frontier had to offer and simply said, "Well, let's get to work," because that's really the whole story. Right there. If you think about it, everything else was just the 2 seasons it took for the rest of the world to catch up to what she already understood.